And welcome. Thank you for tuning in today. You're listening to The Adam Messer Show, and I'm your host, Adam Messer, where I talk with authors, artists, and entertainers. We talk about their process, we also talk about their projects, and overcoming obstacles. Thank you for checking out the show. All right. Thank you, everybody. And you are tuning in today to WRUU-LP Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings Community Radio with Global Soul. And this is the Adam Messer Show. I'm your host, Adam Messer, and we're live here in the studio today. My special guest is an author. Her name is Jennifer Jenkins. Welcome, Jennifer. How are you?
I am great, Adam. How are you?
Oh, great, great, great. And you have a new book out called American Bourbon, right?
Yes, I do.
That's awesome. And it came out in June. And so could you give our listeners just a brief overview of yourself and a little bit about your book?
The book is called American Bourbon. It is about a family of modern-day moonshiners who are very successful and also very dysfunctional at the same time. I think a lot of people in families are going to be able to relate to that no matter what sort of background it is that you come from. I came to fiction a little bit later, actually. I started in the entertainment industry. I did a lot of stage work, and so I wrote a lot of plays. When I went to graduate school, I decided what I wanted to work on was fiction
Okay.
because when you do plays, you get to put all this action on the stage and you get to work with actors and you direct them and sort of bring this together in a more collaborative effort.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't do that on a page. That is something that you give someone to go away and sort of make their own interpretations of. So you have to write all these thoughts and feelings for characters, which was so foreign to me coming from writing plays. And it was a challenge and I loved it. And I had so many terrific people to work with that here I go with a book published, and I'm very happy about it.
Oh, that's great. Well, I'm excited to have you on the show today, and I think it's going to be an interesting. Because everybody, this is the first time Jennifer and I've talked. We've met through a mutual friend, Lenore Pointer. I'm I'm having a brain cramp right now, Jennifer.
Lenore Hart.
Hart,
Married to
thank
David
you.
Poyer. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Because I was like, oh my gosh, I don't know why. Like, it just lost me right there. But anyway, so Lenore and her husband were on the show before, and Lenore was like, hey, I've got one of my author friends, and she might be interested in doing the show. So, we talked to messaging, and here you are.
Here I am. It was very interesting how I got connected with David and Lenore. I had worked a little bit with Lenore through my graduate program.
Mm-hmm.
And then once I had a manuscript and I started to send it out, which is truly one of the hardest things that you will ever do. You have to grow a very thick skin because people will say all kinds of things about all of those lovely words that you thought were lovely that you're sending out. And so there's a lot of rejection. People should know that when you're writing a book and sending out a manuscript for publication. I did have some great people that were interested. There was a publisher out of New York who I actually ended up working with for 2 months about different things about the book, things that they would come in and say, would you consider looking at it from this point of view, or can we make this character a little bit stronger? So we worked on that and we got all the way to the end, and they said, well, we'd really like it though. If the main character, the sister, yeah, if she could be a brother instead. And that's the point at which you say, wow, that would drastically change a lot of what I have written. On the flip side, here is a person out of New York who wants to publish my book.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to think long and hard. What's more important, that I can get a book out there and get my name? Or if I really need to stay true to my message, which is what I ultimately decided to do, because it's a long process to write a book and you put a lot of heart and soul into it every day. And I thought, this is what I want to say. This is what I want to say about families and their relationships and the way that they interact with each other. And so I said no. And people said, "Are you insane?" And I said, "Well, I may be, but I know what it is that I'm trying to say, and this isn't it." And then I saw a call from Northampton House Press, which is where David Poyer works, who is Lenore Hart's husband. And I thought, well, I don't know, but I will send it out to them. And David was the first person to get the book. He wrote to me almost immediately, within just a few weeks, and said, gave me his background and his thoughts on the book. And I felt so good, because I thought, finally I found the person who gets the book, and it was all good from there.
That's a great backstory there.
It's a long one, but I just want to, I guess I want to reiterate to people that there will be somebody out there that understands what you're trying to say. So you don't really have to give up too much. You don't have to change too much.
Hmm.
You can stay true to yourself, and you will still find a publisher.
Yeah, I think that is the balancing act right there, because I'm a small print publisher with Valhalla Books, and working with authors. Um, it's I don't ever want to change somebody's voice. I don't want to do that. Like, I wouldn't ask you to change somebody from a sister to a brother. But stuff that I do ask is like, hey, you know, this needs to be a little bit stronger, or this might be a little bit too wordy, or whatever. And it's also, like, you're dealing with people, so you have to think about. I know it sounds really crazy, but like you said, people, you'll find a publisher that gets your stuff, and it's not going to be for everybody, so.
Do you ever find that you make almost an instant connection with another writer that has submitted something to you?
I have not in that that exact way, but I have connected with other authors that I wanted to work with,
Mhm.
based off of previous writing and works that they've done, and like their personalities and stuff like that. Um, I haven't really opened up a whole lot of submissions lately, because I'm a small print publisher. It's me and a couple other people, and it's one project is a lot of work. So,
Yes.
but I do get unsolicited submissions from time to time, and I have not. I mean, I had one person that I felt like they were a really good writer, but they just, I don't know how to describe it, but they just weren't a good fit,
Mm.
for my publishing house, and so I just had to pass on it, because it wasn't a good fit. But yeah, it's magical though when you do connect with people and you're working on a project together. Like, I've got a person right now that we're working. He's got a couple of urban fantasy books coming out. The guy's a fantastic guy, really great writer. And he came to me after he had published the first one. He wanted to publish the second one with me, and I was like, "Oh wow, this is pretty cool." So yeah, I mean, I have worked with people like that, but I haven't had that connection yet with someone I haven't met before. You know what I mean?
Right, right. Well, I have worked with a couple of different publishing houses before I was ready to send out my manuscript. And it's actually a really good thing for a writer to do if you can hook up with somebody. There were three or four houses that I worked with, doing events and coordinating things, doing some editing, that I would say, this is a really great house, but my book is not a good fit for this.
Yeah,
So the two
yeah.
really don't have to be mutually exclusive,
Mm-hmm.
and I had not submitted my books to them because I knew that it was just not, where we were going to go. So I think that's why it was so exciting when I heard back from David Poyer and what he
Yeah,
had to say. And so that's always a wonderful thing.
that's great. Yeah, I really enjoyed doing the interview with them. They were just very down to earth and humble people, and
Yes.
professional. They're very professional about what they do. I mean, that's one of the things I feel like is so important. You don't have to have a ton of money or like prestige or whatever in the publishing business to be professional. You can be professional at any level, and I feel like it's big too for being open to feedback from people. Both as a writer myself and as a publisher, because if you are not open to feedback, or if like with you with the with the deal where you work with them for a couple months,
Hmm.
and then they ask you to make a pretty dramatic change to your book and your story. I could get why you would want to reject that, because like I have two sisters. I also have two daughters and a son, and their relationships, the sister relationships are a lot different than the ones that I have with them. Sister brother
Right.
versus sister sister, and I could see where that would be like, well, it's not really the story that I wrote. And sometimes you have to walk away. Sometimes you can compromise. Sometimes you can say, hey, let's work on this together. But sometimes you have to say, hmm. Like I had an editor one time that I was working with that and this is the good, the bad, and the ugly. But I had an editor one time because I write for the local newspaper, and the editor changed my writing in an article, changed my voice to passive voice.
Oh.
And I was like, why? I asked the person, I was like, why did you do that? I don't write in passive voice. Why did you? And the response was that it was better for the reader. And I was like, how? How is changing it to passive voice better for the reader? Just because you write like that doesn't mean that I want to write like that. And it was a point of contention. I told the editor, I said, don't ever change my language or my verbiage like that again, because it's not the way I write.
That's terrible. First of all, to change someone else's voice is bad. Just I gotta say from the beginning, but also to change it to passive voice is
Yeah,
easier for I have to disagree with that completely. So
yeah. They're no
wow.
longer there, and it was just a point of contention. And and I'm not opposed to editorial changes, because things happen, and they have to look at what is best for the audience too. Um, but that was one time I remember saying, no, this is not acceptable. It's not. I'm just not going to go that way, because I don't write in passive voice and I don't like it. I know we talk. A lot of times we say things in passive voice, and we use like words like was and be and stuff like that a lot. But I don't write like that.
Yeah, dialogue is different than speaking, so I think that's something also that people have to remember. We're much more casual when we're speaking than we are when we're writing, because
Right.
that's the whole point of writing, is to make it really, really live and make sure that people understand where it is and what's happening with this character. So
I
that
intentionally try to use straightforward and simple language, just because when you're speaking, to keep it clear and try to keep it from being muddled or confusing. But when I
yes.
write, I try to write, at a higher level. Like I am also a graduate. I have an MBA and a Master of Information Systems, and so I can write at the graduate level as well. And that's one of the things I feel like I like to read stuff at a higher level. I don't like stuff that is just simplified and that kind of thing. And I want something that's going to make me think. That's why I'm reading a
Yes.
book, because I want something that's a little bit more challenging.
Yes.
So but that was one thing that I could see where you were like, no, I'm not going to change that character to a brother from a sister.
Yeah.
It's just one of those
Now,
things that's
will
like changes the story up.
right. It is a big change to the story. Now, when I did go to work with Northampton House Press, with David and Lenore, there were many changes that I got, especially from David saying, let's look at this.
Hmm.
Where is he going here? Is this really in the right place? And things like that. I would say that I took probably about 80% of what he had to say and said, you're right, I need to fix this. These were
Hmm.
things that were making the writing tighter. He wasn't
Hmm.
making big editorial changes. But there were some things where I pushed back and said, no, it has to happen this way. And
Hmm.
he would say, okay. And I thought, well, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah,
So
I
it
mean,
was a
I think
really good
I think
process.
that editing process too is it, it's almost like, I mean, nobody's perfect, first of all, right?
No.
And it's almost as if sometimes when I feel like if, at least from my perspective, I don't want to change the writer's voice at all. I don't want to change the writer's voice at all. I look for things that I can help improve, like with the formatting or grammar, or if something's a little confusing, that kind of thing. That's where I try to focus on. But as far as changing the story, or I guess you could say that I do a lot less developmental editing as far as the story and the concept of the story, because I don't want to alter the writer's voice. But I also do like those little nudges, like, hey, what do you think about this? Or hey, what do you think about that? Because I feel like it's one of those things where you're having a conversation about,
Right.
because the first time you write the story, it's for you. The second,
Mhm.
the second that you start editing, it's like, okay, well, this is for the audience.
Yes.
So it might have made sense to me when I was writing it, but then it didn't come across that way on the page. That I was trying to talk about, being in this one area, and I didn't even mention, this city or whatever. So we got to do the station ID real quick, Jennifer. Thank you,
Okay.
everybody. You're tuning in today and listening to the Adam Messer Show here on WRUULP Savannah, Georgia. 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings Community Radio with Global Soul. My special guest today is Jennifer Jenkins, who is an author, and she has written a great book. I haven't read it yet, but it just sounds so interesting, because the way that I grew up in Ohio and Appalachia, Cincinnati and Kentucky and all that, and this book about American bourbon, like I know a little bit about the history of, moonshine and stuff like that in our country, and I've always found it kind of fascinating how bourbon and whiskey came to be here
Hmm.
in the U.S. Um, so could you talk a little bit more about like your book and what you learned about moonshining?
Well, I can take you back with bourbon, and I can say people are always surprised and pleased to learn that it was the government, in fact, that gave us bourbon in the first place. Um, In 1964, the U.S. Congress declared the legalities that it must be 51% corn, it has to be stored in a new charred oak barrel, and it has to be produced in America in order to be called bourbon. So, along the same lines, if you think about champagne, you can get a California champagne and so on and so forth, but it's not really champagne because it has to be produced in the Champagne region of France. It's the same thing with bourbon. There are a lot of different whiskeys out there that are similar to bourbon, may even be made in the same manner. Like a Canadian Club is one that is very similar to bourbon, but it has to be produced in America. And I just love the fact that really this is the quintessential American whiskey. It's what we have to offer the world, and it's very, very popular overseas, believe it or not, in a lot of Ukrainian countries. In Poland, American bourbon is very big deal. So I think that's something that we should be proud of, that we were able to produce something like that. The first person, actually, people always love this as well, who produced the whiskey was, in fact, George Washington.
Oh
And
wow.
so, yes, people often have this idea, well, whiskey or liquor or bourbon, this is something negative, but it doesn't have to be by any means. It's all in how you treat it, it's the way that you respect the alcohol that you're going to consume. So when Washington was doing it, he actually originally bought a 50-gallon still, which at the time, this was the 1760s, early, was pretty big at the time. He put it on his farm in Mount Vernon, and his recipe, or what we call in bourbon speak the mash bill, that's what goes into it, the corn and the sugar and the water, was very similar to the one that was written into law by Congress in 1964. And so by 1799, George Washington actually had the largest distillery in the United States.
Hmm.
And I always like to let people know that so that you can have a little bit of perspective. Because, again, people often think of this as, whiskey or bourbon or even, any alcohol, vodka, tequila, whatever it may be, as something negative. But that's not necessarily what we want to look at. We want to look at it from the standpoint of having a respect for that, whether or not you even drink it, is entirely up to people. So when we go all the way back to George Washington, I think it gives people a chance to really think about um, where this came from and the point of this in the first place. And for Washington, believe it or not, whiskey was actually considered another form of currency at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Distillers were businessmen. So I like to think, we could look at that as, hey, what if we could do that today? Gee, I'm a little short on cash right now for my electric bill, but here's a jug of bourbon that I brewed just for you. How's that exchange?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
That'd
we
be
like that.
that'd be an interesting thing if it weren't illegal, right?
Well, yeah. Well,
It'd be neat
there
if they
is
could
that.
they could still do the still trade like that. But I always thought it was neat because growing up, I always heard about Kentucky bourbon, and
Hmm.
I don't know, like this is just my understanding, and it's probably not historically accurate, but I always heard that was because they had a sugar shortage, and being able to make it like that, and they found that with the corn that they could offset the processing with corn to make it for the alcohol content with the sugar and all. But I don't know. I mean, can you elaborate a little bit and talk about like how they came up with that mash and
Well, actually, the corn was because, and it's so simple, they used what they had on their land.
mm-hmm.
And in the regions, Kentucky and Tennessee and Virginia, what they grew was corn. And so a lot of people would say, well, this is corn, this is what I have, what can I do with this? And that's what because it was very cheap for them at the time. So they would put the corn in, and sugar at the time was also something that they could grow at the same time. So if they had land, which they all did, and they could grow the sugar and they could grow the corn at the same time. It was kind of a win-win situation there. Um, if you're looking back also at the mash bills that came over, because we do call it American whiskey, it is bourbon, but all of these recipes really came over from Europe. A lot of them from Ireland, from England, from Wales. They had been doing this far before we ever thought of it, and we had different names for it. A lot of people in Ireland were making rye
Mm-hmm.
instead, which had different mash bills as well. But really, it was just as simple as we have corn on our land, and so that's what we're going to make for our bourbon. And there are some pictures that I came across during my research of after you make the mash and it goes through the still, then you have the essence of it in the corn, and they would take that out in buckets and they would feed it to their cows. And so
Yeah,
you would see these cows sort of stumbling around every
a
once in a
bunch of
while, but
drunk cows.
looking very happy. Yes.
Yeah, I know that there were a lot of Scott Irish who settled in the Kentucky area too, and
Yes.
like for my family on the Messer side at least, I know that going back, they like Winnie Golden and Moses Messer got married in like the 1860s or whatever. But Winnie Golden, her father was Robert Golden, and he came from the County Tyrone in Ireland, and they got married in Knox County, Kentucky. Um, so that family, my family side goes back to James Messer in 1635 in Edgefield, South Carolina, and so that trying to go back before that, tracing it back, I really can't find the Messers before that, but I know Edgefield, South Carolina was a British settlement, and I know that there were a lot of German ancestors or whatever after Normandy, and the Normans came to England or whatever. So I thought it was interesting how the folks there when they came over and they settled, because Kentucky was a Commonwealth of Virginia, and all the folks, like there are a lot of people for the Revolutionary War after were given like land grants for their service as payment, right? And so they were given, land grants, and there was also a way for them to push settlements out, further and further, to claim land and all that, for the 13 colonies and then the states and all that. But I always thought it was interesting with the Scot-Irish and the Irish, that they came to, the U.S. People came from all over, but they came to the U.S. and, they brought over those traditions of, making, whiskey and things like that. And they did use, stuff that was available here versus like, maybe stuff that they had back home. But they just adapted it to, what they had available here.
They absolutely did. And that's one of the things that also, going back into the history of making moonshine, is people are very proud of their mash bills. They're proud of the generations in their families that have made alcohol. Again, looking at it as this is something, that we have created together. And every generation there would always be one person to say, let's take this a little bit farther. What if we added a little bit of this? Or what if we held back a little bit on that? To make it their own, to make it distinct, so that people could then go and say, okay, this is what Blanton's tastes like, as opposed to this is what Jim Beam tastes like. Or if you want to get really into the very, very expensive bourbon, this is a Pappy Van Winkle, which is sort of the crown jewel of the bourbon world as well. But
Pappy Van Winkle?
Pappy Van Winkle.
Oh, that's
yes.
awesome. I never heard of that. And it was so funny, y'all. For those of you playing along at home, and some of you who know me, I quit drinking 2 years ago in July. And one of my drinks, though, before that I used to like was whiskey. I'd like to have a whiskey, sometimes just straight up, sometimes on ice, or sometimes with a, like a soda, like a Coke or something like that. But that was always one of the drinks that I enjoyed having. I don't drink anymore, and I don't plan on drinking anymore, but that would have been a neat one to try, would be Pappy Van Winkle.
Well, if you could get it. They do not produce it any longer, and there's a long, wonderful history. There's actually a book called Pappyland, a nonfiction book that someone wrote, and I believe it came out last fall, which is a wonderful resource about that particular brand. But some of the different years of Pappy Van Winkle go for, I think at Pappy 23, the last I saw was close to $10,000 a bottle.
What?
Yes.
For how big of a bottle?
Just a regular bottle.
Like a pint?
So that will tell you how crazy.
Like a 16-ounce pint?
Yeah.
What?
Well, it would be, a good bottle, but you can't get it anymore. They're not producing it anymore. So you look at it that way and say, I think that's for real aficionados of bourbon to say, okay, this is what I'm going to spend my money on right here.
Yeah, you got that's one of those little power shows, like, hey, I've got Pappy Van Winkle tonight.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. You're like, you can afford Pappy Van Winkle? Yeah, drink as much as you want. Yeah. have you a Pappy on me.
There you go.
That's so funny. Well, we're going to do the station announcements, Jennifer, and we'll be back in a few minutes, everybody. And you're listening today to WRUU LP Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings Community Radio with Global Soul. My special guest today is Jennifer Jenkins, and we're talking about writing, and then we're talking about her new book called American Bourbon. Jennifer, where can people find American Bourbon at?
You can get this at all the big booksellers, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. I like to suggest people go to a site called bookshop.org, because they actually reach out to smaller local merchants and can send you the book, because we're always trying to support the people that, have the small shops everywhere. But really, you can get it just about anywhere now.
Okay, great. All right, so we'll be back in a few minutes, y'all.
What does it mean when we say that WRUU is a community radio station? It doesn't just mean that we invite the community to create programming. And it doesn't just mean that we are a voice for the community. It also means that we are counting on the community to keep us going. And you are the community. Almost all of our modest budget comes from small annual or monthly donations from listeners like you. You get to enjoy our community-focused programming because many others have stepped forward to do their part. Now do your part by joining our community of listener donors. Go to wruu.org right now and make a one-time or monthly donation. And thank you for supporting Savannah's community radio station, 107.5 FM.
Enjoy great art songs, opera arias, and a solo recital in the beautiful rotunda of the Telfair Academy as part of the 9th season of the Savannah Voice Festival from August 8th through August 22nd. More information about the festival and tickets can be found at www.savannahvoicefestival.org. This portion of WRUU Savannah Soundings programming is provided by listeners and by Brighter Day Natural Foods. Brighter Day Natural Foods has been serving Savannah's healthy food and supplement needs since 1978. It is located at the corner of Bull Street and Park Avenue. They have available online ordering and curbside delivery, and now a walk-up window for smoothies, juices, and sandwiches from the deli. They are open from 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. Monday through Saturday, and 12 to 5:30 p.m. on Sunday. More information can be found at brighterdayfoods.com.
All right, and we're back, everybody, and thank you for your support of WRUU. We are a community radio station, and I just want to just throw this out there. This is my third year doing the show here, the Adam Messer Show, and we've got a group of like about 60 plus different people who are hosts that volunteer to help with the studio, with running the station, and all those other things. And we're all a big group of people trying to bring these radio shows out here to y'all and for us too. And we can't do it without your support. So thank you very much, especially if you donated in the past. It is a nonprofit. So if you go to wruu.org, you can make a donation right there, even as little as $1. You wouldn't believe it or not, but that actually helps a lot. So thank you very much, and please consider making a donation today or in the near future. So, Jennifer, we're back on the air, and I always thought history was interesting, especially when you talk about like the Revolutionary War, and you talk about the turn of the century and the Industrial Revolution, because the way that we farm, the way that we produce, agriculture and things like that is all changed. And especially like, alcohol and tobacco and firearms, that's why they have the ATF, agency. But those three things are, some of the most regulated products because they're so popular, and they are like a currency when people don't have money,
Exactly. Yes. Did you know that they've actually added on explosives to that as well? So they still refer to it as the ATF, but it is alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and explosives.
Wow.
Yes. So we're making all this progress, I suppose.
Yeah. One of the things I wanted to talk with you, and that's why I was talking about like the Industrial Revolution and machine processing of things. These families, or this family that you talk with or whatever, you said that it's an interesting dynamic that they have, and obviously back in the day with a distillery, it's a big, basically it's just a big drum, and they have these copper tubes, and it processes through, and the alcohol evaporates and it goes through and all that by hand. With that and the traditional style of making it versus like machine made stuff, like an industrial product or whatever, the way that things are processed. What did you find with that, like with small batch, like when you're talking to them, did you talk to them about, like small batch making versus like, big manufacturers, who produce thousands and thousands of gallons a day?
Well, it's interesting to follow the progress from the people who started way back when to have, a still on their farm to what we have now, again, as you said, with all the industrial production going on. Um, People were doing this, as a way to make money and also as a way to show off their pride in their family and their recipes. And as you said, with history, one of the things that actually turned alcohol in the end into something highly illegal was the American Revolution because it was expensive. War costs a lot of money. And so that's initially when taxes were slapped onto liquor to pay for the war. People did not like this. They had been doing their own thing for hundreds of years, and now they were significant amounts of taxes. So then they would send out these revenue agents to people that they heard were still producing whiskey without putting any tax on it. And this is where they actually started with tarring and feathering these revenue agents that would go out. And you think these are people that are going out up into the mountains to talk to families to say, hey, I heard you're making whiskey here, and coming back and saying, I'm never going back there again as I'm now covered with tarred with feathers.
Mm-hmm.
So that wasn't a fun job. So then that turned into the Whiskey Rebellion, and that was a big thing at the time. And that directly affected George Washington as well. So he had to show that had the strength as a leader in a new country, but he had to draw a line in the sand about the legalities of liquor. And so, in order to pay for the revolution, he had to stand behind the taxes that he had put on that, which is actually where the term moonshiner comes from, because when he did that, that's what served to make all of the people who were creating the liquor say, okay, now we're going to do this at night when no one can see what we're doing, when there's no one around, and therefore we're doing this by the light of the moon. And there you have moonshine right there. So all of these, when you go far back into this, all of these terms start to make sense, and it's really interesting to see how far back you can go with that. Um, and the difference as well when you go into, for instance, when this particular family, the family in the book is called the McKinseys. And so when they begin, they are doing the same thing. They have a farm, they're making their whiskey. They have this beautiful limestone stream that is nearby. That is one of the biggest considerations, is the water that actually goes into your liquor. So they use this very clear, fresh limestone water that goes into the liquor. And then at one point, one of their ancestors, because they're in Virginia, which is where the book takes place, and there's a lot of peaches in Virginia, and they had peach trees. So they decided, well, why don't we just put a little bit of peach in there, and that will be our thing. That's what we will be known for. That will be our taste. So they started to create a product they called Bourbon Sweet Tea. Didn't have any tea in it, but it was a little bit similar to tea. And sweet tea also is very big in the South. I'm sure you know all about that. So it was very similar in the way that they produced it, with fresh corn and fresh peaches and the water that was coming down the mountain. Now, when it goes into legalities, because the patriarch of the book, Caleb McKinsey, does decide at some point that he needs to legalize everything. So he works very hard on setting up a new distillery with everything that is up to code, meeting all of the legalities and all of the registrations, which change just as soon as he has met them, because it's a very difficult thing to do and it's a very expensive thing to do. So now, in essence, he creates this big company known as Bourbon Sweet Tea. Unfortunately, at that point, they're not using fresh peaches anymore because now they're very expensive. So they're using a very much cheaper sucrose than the peaches. They're also using city water coming out of Charlottesville instead of what's coming down the mountain because it's more plentiful to them. So you can see as you go through this history the changes that are made from something that was very true and honest to something as it went into a big legal distillery with 1,000-gallon copper pots. That's not quite the same anymore.
Yeah, I think that's the problem sometimes you have with handmade or handcrafted versus something that is factory assembled or uh, a watered down version of itself, basically.
Yes.
And interestingly enough, I heard the story the other day talking about peaches in colonial times. That the peach was not a native plant here in the in this region of the world at all, and the Spaniards brought it over, from what I understand, and the indigenous people that were here loved it so much that they started cultivating lots and lots of different styles of peaches up and down the East Coast here, and that by the time the settlers came, like the English settlers came, like they thought that the peach trees were indigenous here, but they weren't. They were trees that had been cultivated by the indigenous peoples. And
I did not know that.
yeah, I heard that story the other day, and I thought it was so interesting because the indigenous folks that were here, they were great agricultural cultivationists. The three sisters that they talk about, what was it, beans and corn and squash,
Yes.
So I always thought that was interesting because a lot of the settlers or a lot of the people that came here, they were able to benefit from those things that were here already, and especially like if you think about peach trees. I mean, a good peach tree takes a little while to grow, and especially to be fruiting. And so I can imagine if they were, using fresh peaches versus like, pretty much processed syrup from,
Yes.
leftover peaches. Because, they don't usually use the freshest ones to make that syrup. They use, what's not able to be sold at the market,
Exactly.
Kind of like grade A versus anything else.
Yes.
Grade B is not. There's nothing wrong with it because you can make. You can make all kinds of baked goods and stuff like that. It's just like it might be dinged up or it might have like a bad spot that they cut out and they still use the other part and all kinds of things like that. But that's interesting that you talk about that because I imagine too when they go into the processing, they were using different ingredients. They were using the same kind of ingredients, but they were different. And use, like you said, 1,000 1-gallon copper pots.
Right.
I imagine that changed the flavor of it as well.
Yes.
Because at that point they were probably boiling it versus letting it. They were probably boiling it in the pot versus it being distilled. The way that they originally did it.
Yes, big difference. Saving a lot of time, if you want to call it saving, from when you think about moonshiners that were probably producing maybe 20 gallons a week at their height because this was, their family farm and that's what they did, to being able to put in 1,000-gallon stills is kind of astounding. So it just, you look at it as, pretty much I think with a lot of products you can say, this was good when it started, but it doesn't taste the same anymore. And you're probably right. Yes.
And we've got to do the station ID real quick. Everybody, you're tuning in today, listening to WRUU LP Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings Community Radio with Global Soul. So kind of going back to the historical part of this. So did you in your book, did you trace like the history throughout, American bourbon, from like Washington times to like Civil War through Prohibition to today, or?
I did a lot of research because if you're going to write about something like bourbon, you have to make sure you're going to get it right. Absolutely. And so this is when really bootleg hit for bourbon was during Prohibition. And this is when the cars started to be a very big deal within moonshine, because now you've got people who are still not only refusing the taxes but also making illegal alcohol. So you've got two strikes against you there. So you've got these mountain families who are learning to produce and get the cars that will best serve them. The one they use in the book, and this was one that was actually used a lot at the times, was a 1944 coupe, and they had made it as low to the ground as they possibly could. They had carved out extra space within the trunk so that you could put gallons of liquor in the trunk, and then you could put a false floor over it if you wanted to. So if you knew you were going to be in a place to be stopped, you could pop the trunk and you could say, well, see, there's no alcohol in there because you had a false floor in it as well. Now, a lot of the producers would actually just fill the trunk all the way up as far as they could, and they would ride with their rifles as well, keeping them down on the floor over the mountain roads, going into wherever they had set up to meet their distributors. So they also had the cars. If you have ever seen a picture of a 1944 coupe, you can see that the windshields and the windows are very narrow. It really does look like a gangster car, I guess is what you want to say, because you didn't want to have a lot of space for the sheriffs to be able to shoot you. So your windows were very small, specifically for that reason. They also learned with the cars to be able to drive them as fast and as twisty as possible, because you're also talking about mountain roads that you're going up and down. And a lot of times they were driving these mountain roads with no lights on because they didn't want to be seen. So they learned the roads very well, but this is also where the hairpin turns came in, because my gosh, if you've ever seen, there are a few very old clips of usually rum runner cars making these hairpin turns, and they're almost 180 degrees, and you can see the police cars trying to follow them, and they either simply just spin out or they flip over, which was another thing that was very good for the coupes, because they were so low to the ground and they were also heavy with all of the alcohol that they could stay more stable than the police cars that were chasing them. So there was a lot of danger to this, especially during Prohibition, because this is what they did and this is how they earned their money. And there is a lot of stubbornness within this as well, with the, you don't get to tell me what to do. This is the product that I'm making, and I'm going to continue to sell it. And that is that.
Did you ever hear that song Copperhead Road by Steve Earle?
Yes.
I was like, I always loved that song. I was a kid, and I just listened to you talk about this, and that's what that song's all about. Is his family, fictional family or whatever. I don't know how much I'd have to see, but I don't know how much truth of it was. But yeah, you could see like the generations of the people going through, and being a runner, like a. I don't know if they were making rum or bourbon or what they were making, but they were moonshiners,
Yes. They called them rum runners, even though they were running whiskey. I think that was an old term that probably came over from Europe. The same as bootleggers, the same thing.
Well, that's what I was talking about earlier when I was saying that they started doing whiskey or bourbon because of a lack of sugar, because, rum and whiskey are like, they're almost the same drink, but sugar content type. And so the colonialists didn't have access to sugar cane, during the Revolutionary War. And, they were growing corn and stuff like that, but it's just not the same as cane sugar. And,
yes.
So that's what I had always heard, was that was the reason why, Kentucky whiskey or bourbon became so popular, that because it was, they could make it. you know.
Right. It doesn't require the same amount of sugar that rum does. So I think that was a big plus to it as well.
Yeah, and it's not as sweet either. I mean, it's like, I don't know, and like I said, I don't drink anymore, but I know when I did, I used to always like ones that were not super bitter. I like ones that were a little bit sweeter. Actually, when you're talking about the peach flavored, that would have been a flavor that I would have enjoyed trying, but I'm not drinking anymore, so I don't do that.
There is, I will say, a slight danger to adding different flavors to, particularly, I will say, bourbon. The last time that I checked, you could buy apple bourbon is a very big one. Apple pie bourbon, that's something that a lot of people like. Cherry is also a very big one now in liquor stores. I've seen that one as well.
Well,
I
like
saw blackberry
cinnamon,
bourbon. Yes.
like Fireball, the cinnamon flavored whiskey.
Fireball is a whole other side of hell. It's just really difficult. That is a taste that people do not want to have, in my opinion. But I think sometimes if you put too much flavoring into a whiskey, it makes it so much easier to drink a lot more of it. And I'm not really a fan of that either.
Yeah, that's the thing. I think with anything, it's in moderation.
Yes.
It's in moderation, and being able to, it's like having a steak dinner, like you don't want to eat steak every night. I know some people that they like to eat steak every night. It's just not for me.
Yes.
If I want a nice juicy steak dinner, it's kind of be like a treat or something like that. I don't want it like every night. So.
I think you appreciate it more if it's something you can look forward to.
Yeah. I agree with you. So Jennifer, we're wrapping up this first hour, and where can people find out more information about you and your book?
On Instagram and also on Facebook, you can find it under American Bourbon the Book, in both of those places. And I also have a website, which is jenniferjenkinsauthor.com, which you can find places that I am going out to do readings, that I'm going to festivals and presenting the book and things of that nature. There's also some links there as well to other pieces that have been presented in literary magazines, basically, which is also a thing you do when you're writing. If you have something, that you think, oh, this is really good, you can definitely submit different pieces to different literary magazines, again, doing research to finding out what it is that people are really interested to. So there are some links there as well. So that's jenniferjenkinsauthor.com. And also for Instagram and for Facebook, it is under American Bourbon the Book.
Well, that's awesome. And we're going to be back in the second hour talking more with Jennifer about her book, American Bourbon. And so y'all stay tuned, and thank you for listening. And thank you for tuning in today, and I appreciate you listening to The Adam Messer Show. You can check us out at theadammessershow.com, and we're also on YouTube at youtube.com/Adam Messer. Love to hear your feedback. Thanks. And thank you for tuning in today, and I appreciate you listening.
You are listening.